What if time passed differently during the Hadean Eon? Not slower, not faster, but stranger. A rhythm older than rhythm, before memory could fossilize into stone. Wherever you are tonight, beneath city light or clouded dusk, I'm glad you're here. Let the weight of the day fall away. Let the hush of deep time hold you. And listen, as the earth begins to remember. The earth was once not earth. It had no name, no face, no edges. It did not turn gently beneath a sky. There was no sky. It did not carry oceans in its arms. It had no arms. It was becoming. A child of collapse, born from the breathless hush that follows explosion, spinning not from silence, but from aftermath. From the remains of something far too bright. A star had died, and in that death, there bloomed a storm of ash, too fine for vision, too ancient for memory. From this ash, planets were imagined, not built, not shaped. Imagined, Earth was one such imagining, a cloud of molten sorrow spiraling inward, drunk on gravity, curling tighter and tighter, until the sorrow became heat, and the heat became form. There were no nights, there were no days, only gradients of fire, and the sky, if one could call it that, was a haze of iron vapour and starlight ghosts, a ceiling of boiling dust, lit by a sun that had not yet decided to love. The moon did not yet exist. It was still inside us, waiting to be thrown. The crust had not congealed. The ocean had not begun to weep. And time was raw. Not linear, not gentle, but violent, molten, uncountable. The clocks that now measure our hours would have cracked in its presence. For this was not time. This was temperature. This was motion. This was radioactive breath. The earth trembled, not from tectonics, but from uncertainty. Each second was a storm. Each hour, a birth of fire. Volcanoes without names split the forming surface with no warning, but there was no witness. Only carbon watching carbon. Only magma folding into itself. And somewhere in that folding, a rhythm began. Not a beat, a burden, a weight, settling. In the isotope haze, atoms rearranged their prayers. Hydrogen whispered to oxygen, tentative, like a forgotten lullaby. Could there be water? Could there be stillness? Could there be the possibility of soft? The planet was unsure, and so it burned, for millions of years. Its heart, too full of grief, could not cool fast enough. The metals inside it warred, not with rage, but with inertia. The memory of falling had not yet left their bones. Somewhere above this seething mantle, a crust tried to form, and failed, and tried again. These attempts were brief, transient rafts of solidity, adrift on oceans of fire, and each time they sank, they told the planet one thing: not yet. The Earth listened. It was good at listening, especially to its own breaking. From the chaos of heat came the first whispers of differentiation. Heavy sank, light rose, iron to the center, silicates to the skin. This was not a choice. It was gravity, smoothing the madness into form. But still, no light broke through, no blue, no breath. The planet was alone, speaking in languages made only of pressure. But in those languages, something sacred stirred. The memory of stardust had not yet faded. And the planet, though young, was not entirely empty. It carried the songs of isotopes, the lullabies of decay. In the bones of uranium, in the breath of thorium, time began to etch its first fragile syllables into the stone that had no name. These were not ages, not yet. They were echoes, timeless ghosts, of a clock that ticks by unraveling, a countdown before memory could begin. The earth dreamed, not as a mind does, but as a body does when touched by heat. It convulsed, settled, collapsed, rose. And from these movements, patterns began. They were not life, they were not even promise, but they were becoming. Somewhere, in a dark plain of boiling rock, a single zircon crystal cooled enough to survive. And in that survival, time curled up and slept, not lost, just waiting. Because the Hadean did not forget, it simply had no voice to speak. Yet, the earth did not cool all at once. It forgot how. Its fever was too old, its fire too deep. Born from violence, it knew only how to burn. But even fire forgets its hunger. Even chaos begins to slow. And so, somewhere within the furnace, the first breath of cooling began. Not like rain, not like wind, but like memory surfacing through sleep. The mantle churned, sluggish, thick with heat, but beginning to remember rest. Above it, a crust attempted to form once more, this time stronger, not permanent, but determined. Rafts of proto-crust floated across magma seas, their edges red-hot, their undersides glowing. They hissed with the fury of contact, like skin touching coals. They cracked, they splintered, but they stayed, longer than before, and in their staying, they made space for silence. This silence was not the absence of sound, it was the absence of interruption, the absence of war between heat and cold. For the first time, the planet breathed inward, not deeply, not fully, but enough. Enough for ash to settle, enough for minerals to find each other, and in the folds of that silence, a shadow passed. The moon. Not the moon as it is now, but the ghost of its making, a memory still wet with fire. There are many stories told about how the moon came to be, but this one is older, not a tale, a tremor. The earth had been struck, not gently, not glancing, but utterly, a body, another forming planet, an intruder of similar size, collided with the earth. In a moment no mind will ever remember. The impact did not leave a scar, it became the scar. It reshaped the body itself. The earth did not shatter, it bled, it ejected, it screamed in molten light. From that scream, fragments spiraled into orbit. They gathered, they circled, they cooled, and one day they became the moon, our moon. But not yet. Now, it hovered too close, large in the sky, tugging at the planet's tides, before oceans even existed. Its gravity-carved motion into the molten skin of Earth, dragging the crust, teaching it rhythm, not music, but repetition. And repetition, given enough time, becomes memory. The Earth learned, not quickly, not consciously, but in layers, layer upon layer, like breath laid into snow, like ash settling into stone. Each moment of cooling became a line. Each pulse of pressure became a whisper. And somewhere in those whispers, oxygen began to stir. Not in air, but in rock, bound to silicates, trapped in minerals, buried deep, because the sky, such as it was still poison. A cloak of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, methane. It was thick, hot, oily with atmosphere. It did not welcome, it did not forgive. And yet, within that pressure, light scattered in strange ways. There was no blue, only ochre, amber, blood-coloured twilight. Rain fell, acidic and uncertain, not to nourish, but to carve, and carve it did. The crust cracked beneath it, the surface hissed with corrosion, but slowly, always slowly, those rains filled the basins. They pooled in the scars, they lingered in the low places, and in their lingering, they cooled the world. Steam became fog, fog became sky. The sky became an echo of the ocean dreaming below it. Still, there was no life, only chemistry, lonely, exquisite, endless. The planet was not dead, it was not alive, it was waiting. In its waiting, it changed. Each mineral forming, each isotope decaying, each crystal resisting dissolution, a quiet act of defiance against the void that came before. These were not events, they were murmurs, whispers of future possibility, like seeds trapped beneath glaciers, like voices trapped beneath ash, not forgotten, simply not yet. And so, the Earth continued to dream. It dreamed in layers, in magma, in impact scars, in the slow birth of land. Each trembling breath of cooling etched a new line in its silence. Each shiver of gravity pulled it closer to form, closer to memory, and though no eye beheld it, though no mind traced the horizon, the planet stirred, not to speak, but to hold, to cradle what it did not yet know it would one day become, a keeper of oceans, a bearer of sky, a planet that once was ash, and now was almost ready to remember. Time did not rush. It wandered, across a crust still unsure of itself, across oceans not yet blue, across atmospheres heavy with ancient breath. Time moved not like wind, but like depth. It pressed downward, into rock, into memory, into heat, and in pressing, it began to settle. Because in the Hadean, time did not pass. It pooled. It gathered in mineral seams, in isotopic balances, in the delicate lattice of zircon crystals that had no eyes, but remembered everything. These crystals, born of fire, cooled by grief, were the first pages of Earth's diary. They were not large, not loud, but they endured. Endurance is its own language, and the Earth spoke it fluently. In those zircons, trapped like breath between the layers, were whispers of water, of formation, of patience. Atoms decayed, and, in their decay, they sang, not in sound, but in patterns, in ratios of lead and uranium, in fingerprints left behind by half-lives. To the sleeping mind, this means nothing. To the dreaming Earth, it was scripture, a soft ledger of beginnings, written in elemental ghosts. And so the Hadean wore on, not as a sequence, but as a weight. Each million years fell like a single sigh. Each epoch bled into the next, with no border, no name, no witness. But names are not required for memory. The rocks remembered without them, and the sky, that thick and brooding sky, slowly thinned. Not enough to see stars, not enough to speak, but enough to feel. Clouds gathered in strange shapes. Rain fell in longer intervals. Pools became lakes. Lakes became seas. The oceans, born of steam and silence, spread across the surface like a bruise. There was no blue, only iron and acid, only temperature. But water had arrived, not to nourish, but to listen, to press itself against rock and learn its contours, to fill its cracks and carry away its minerals, to soften what fire had once made cruel. The ocean did not ask permission, it simply came, and with it came the potential for memory to move, because before life there was only place, and before place there was only pattern. The patterns were everything. How one atom meets another, how heat escapes, how light bends. These were not stories, they were seeds, and the earth cradled them, blindly, silently, as if afraid that to speak too soon would break the spell of becoming. And above this hush, the moon continued its slow retreat. It drifted farther with each century, stretching the tides, teaching the planet how to breathe in rhythm. The day grew longer. The spin began to slow, and the Earth, once dizzy with rotation, began to hold still, just enough to start remembering. Because what is memory, if not stillness made sacred? What is silence, if not space for remembering to begin? And so, beneath the tides, beneath the crust, beneath the sky too heavy to hold stars, the Earth began to listen to itself, to the sounds made by isotope decay, to the ache of heat escaping, to the low, slow rhythm of cooling stone. The Hadean was not a beginning. It was an inhale, a pause so vast, it took 500 million years to exhale. But in that pause, every possibility curled inwards, wrapped in silica, suspended in ocean, echoed in vapor. No fire burned forever. No silence lasted without shape. Even ash, in time, finds form. And the earth, young, ancient, molten, weary, was ready to begin becoming what it did not yet know it could be. The planet did not know it was a planet. It did not yet wear its name. It had no languages to declare itself, no myths to crown its crownless sky. But still, it turned, slowly now, not from effort, but from memory. Memory older than form, older than gravity's grasp, older than light, learning how to fall. The earth, child of collision, sibling of silence, was no longer collapsing. It was cradling, within the folds of its crust, Thin as a sigh, fragile as sleep, lay remnants of stardust still warm with origin. They hummed, not with melody, but with patience, and from that patience, time began to carry shape. Zircon, again. So small, so persistent, a relic of magma oceans that cooled enough to whisper. Each zircon was a vessel, not for life, but for waiting. For what is waiting, if not time learning how to hold itself? And so the Hadean learned to hold heat, to hold silence, to hold the burden of becoming without the urgency of arrival, because nothing needed to arrive. Not yet. The journey was still made of mist. The continents, if one could call them that, were not continents at all. They were ghosts, volcanic shadows drifting on molten breath, cratons unborn, islands of uncertainty. And yet, they tried. Time and again, the crust rose and fell, lifted by buoyancy, dragged down by weight. Subduction, long before it had a name, began to shape the rhythm of geology, not as violence, but as folding. Folding memory into mantle, folding pressure into stone, folding silence into layers, so that one day a future mind might read them, like scripture left in a forgotten tongue. There was no tectonic dance, not yet, only the slow waltz of heat and gravity, learning each other's steps. The dance left behind trails of transformation, metamorphosed rock, melted traces, ancient scars sealed by time's own weight. These scars did not fade, they deepened, for the earth was not interested in healing, it was interested in remembering. Every eruption was a sentence, every collapse a comma, every silence a page, and the pages piled up, not in stacks, but in layers, thick, unknowable layers of unspoken becoming. And the oceans watched, dark, churning, unbroken by wave or shore. They had no tides, only longing, dragged by the moon, into motion. Tidal rhythms had begun, but they were not gentle. They were chaos disguised as pulse. Every pull of gravity stirred the sea, dragged at the molten crust, pulled the sky's gases into movement. And in that movement, a kind of breath, a breath not of lungs, but of rhythm. And rhythm, if given enough time, becomes invitation. The invitation was not to life, not yet, but to complexity, to uncertainty, to molecules becoming more than mere shape. The oceans were not inert. They were cauldrons, heated from below, stirred from above, infused with minerals from vents in the seafloor, where the planet still whispered fire. Black smokers, chimneys of unseen heat, exhaling ancient breath into darkness. Nothing swam there, nothing blinked, but the chemistry gathered, quietly, gathered into patterns that would one day begin to dream, but not yet. The Hadean was a lullaby, not a birth. Its gift was not life, but readiness. It gave the earth structure. It gave the seas depth. It gave silence the shape of stone, and heat the patience to wait. Because every becoming requires a before, and this was the before of all befores. The dream before dreaming, the memory before mind, the ash before breath. The earth did not speak, but it remembered everything, not in words, not in thought, but in pressure and fracture and the slow curling of minerals around a whisper. Silence was its first memory, not an emptiness, but a presence too vast for sound, a weight too sacred for interruption. It lay beneath the oceans, curled in the crust, etched into the oldest grains of zircon, like a lullaby written in ash. For even in silence, the world was not still. Beneath the crust, beneath the mantle, the core churned. It spun, it pulsed, it bled heat, in currents unseen. The geodynamo was not yet awake, but it dreamed, and that dreaming was enough to nudge the planet's breath into motion. Convection, the poetry of heat rising, cooling, falling again, had begun its slow recitation. In that motion, the crust shifted, cracked, buckled, not in rage, but in memory, because motion is not destruction, it is the longing to become, and the earth, though still nameless, longed to become something more than fire. The The fire, though ancient, was growing tired. Each eruption bled into ocean, each fissure folded into itself, and with every cycle of melting and cooling, new minerals were born, not randomly, but with quiet intent. Granites, gabbros, felsic whispers. In the chorus of Mayfic's song, the rock cycle had not begun, not officially, but it was rehearsing, practicing, the turning of stone into story. Because what else is stone, if not story made solid? The planet was writing without ink. It wrote in pressure, in layering, in decay. The first continents, if they can be called such, were flickers, rafts of buoyant crust, floating above a sea of memory. They did not last, but they tried. Like dreams that fade upon waking, they dissolved, but left behind traces. Traces found today in tiny, ancient crystals, older than bones, older than sky, older than the idea of age itself. The Jack Hills of Australia, a place where Earth keeps its deepest memories, cradle some of these grains. Zircons, over 4.3 billion years old, survived every forgetting. And in their survival, they whisper, there was water, there was crust, there was waiting. Long before life, the Earth was already learning how not to forget. It pressed every silence into stone. It folded every failure into form. It turned collapse into cradle. Because forgetting is only possible when something first dares to remember. And the Earth was beginning to dare, to hold shape, to hold silence, to hold time, not as passage, but as presence. The moon still loomed close, each night, if one could call it that. It filled half the sky. Its pull was immense. Its love, violent. Tides surged, unshaped by continents, unchecked by shores. Water collided with rock, again and again, until even erosion became sacred. Because erosion is not destruction, it is intimacy. It is time's way of touching what it cannot hold. The oceans caressed the crust, and the crust, for the first time, yielded. Mountains that rose quickly fell. Islands that burned quickly sank. And in the falling, in the sinking, in the softening, a kind of grace was born, not life, but its possibility. Every mineral washed to sea was a sentence unfinished. Every atom rearranged was a thought not yet spoken. And the earth, patient as only stone can be, waited. The night had no stars. Not yet. They were there, but hidden, shrouded behind the veils of carbon skies and methane clouds, thick with the breath of volcanoes. Above, a twilight that never cleared. Below, an ocean that never rested. And between them, Earth, still forming, still folding, still uncertain, but no longer empty. Because in the spaces between eruptions, between impacts, between the cooling breaths of magma, something else had begun. Not movement, not memory, but presence, the kind that settles, deep in the crust, like sleep in a tired body. It was in this stillness that the planet became sacred, not for what it held, but for how long it held it, for how it carried silence, longer than any voice could endure, for how it bore fire without needing to extinguish it, for how it carried time, not as burden, but as bone. Even in its chaos, the Earth was keeping vigil. It watched every zircon survive, every isotope decay, every tide pull against its skin. And in that watching, something like rhythm was born, a rhythm made of gravity and heat and pressure and pause. It did not resemble time as it is known now. It did not resemble life, but it resembled longing, and longing, given enough silence, becomes invitation. In the cracks of cooling crust, in the vents beneath the sea, in the mineral seams of forgotten fire, elements gathered. They did not know what they were forming, but they stayed long enough to rearrange, to combine, to fail, to combine again. There were no miracles, only endless attempts, only molecules meeting in the dark. And the Earth, silent and vast, held space for their meeting, because before life, there was the condition for life. Before breath, the ocean learned to hold breathlessness. Before memory, there was patience, and the Hadean was nothing, if not patient. 500 million years of silence and fire, of ash and settling, of near forgetting and almost becoming. No chapters, no climax, only the soft layering of time into stone. The first pages of Earth's story were not written with ink. They were etched with erosion, with impact, with longing, and when the Hadean ended, if such a thing can ever truly end, it did not close like a book. It faded, it softened into the Archaean, not as a new beginning, but as a continuation of the dream. For nothing was lost, nothing was left behind. It had only been folded beneath silence, waiting to rise again. When the planet remembered how to speak, time, in the Hadean, did not behave. It did not flow forward, like a river seeking its end. It did not count, like clocks in temples, or calendars carved by civilizations that had not yet imagined themselves. Time did not pass. It settled, like ash after fire, like dust after breath, like sorrow after storm. It fell downward, slowly, imperceptibly, into stone. And the stone, ancient, unblinking, silent as the core of a star, caught it, not with purpose, not with intention, but with gravity, the gravity of memory before there was mind. The planet, still wrapped in vapor and ache, began to record the unrecordable, not through writing, but through decay, because decay, though quiet, marks time without forgiveness. In the heart of minerals, trapped like breath beneath crystal skin, radioactive isotopes began their slow unraveling. Uranium, thorium, potassium. They did not speak. They released. Tiny particles, tiny flashes, invisible gestures, from one state to another. And in that shifting, a clock, a whisper of duration that could not be heard, only measured. The Earth had found a way to hold time, not in moments, but in transformation. Each isotope a story, each decay a verse, each ratio a hymn to what had come before. The first clocks on Earth were not made by hands. They were made by forgetting, because decay is not destruction. It is a remembering through loss. A parent isotope becomes a daughter. The daughter becomes another. And in that lineage, time is drawn, not as line, but as echo. The planet became a cathedral of isotopic prayer. And the rocks, those slow witnesses, gathered the prayers, like dust on stained glass. Deep in the crust, in places no light would ever touch, the first timekeepers began their descent. Zircons again, patient archivists. Inside them, uranium trapped at birth, slowly decayed to lead, marking the years, not with numbers, but with ratios. No watcher observed it, no observer recorded it. And yet, the record grew. This was not memory, as the mind understands it. This was memory, as stone understands it. Endless, silent, heavy. Time thickened. It did not move past. It curled inward. It sank. Each atom that changed was a page turned. Each moment that folded was a breath held. The crust, layered now with scars and sighs, grew heavier. Not from mass, but from knowing, because stone that holds time is no longer just stone, it is witness. The earth, unaware of its holiness, was becoming sacred, not for its heat, not for its water, not even for its future, but for its willingness to keep what could not be spoken. And so, in the slow ballet of half-lives and subduction, of cooling and decay, of erosion and silence, the Hadean slipped into the deep rhythm of time. Time not as passage, but as weight, as memory curled into zircon seeds, wrapped in crust, pressed into depth. The story of time on Earth did not begin with clocks. It began with atoms, surrendering themselves to change. And the change, quiet and constant, was sacred, because what changes slowly never forgets. In the Hadean, time had no numbers, only temperature and density and the hush between eruptions. It was measured in half-lives, not lives, in isotopic size, not seasons. There were no trees to grow rings, no rivers to etch years into floodplains, only the slow rearrangement of what was once stardust becoming something almost stable. And that stability, fragile, flickering, like steam over stone, became a rhythm so deep it could not be heard, only held in crystal, in basalt, in the buried breath of minerals, long cooled. The earth, wrapped in vapor, wore this rhythm like skin. It was not a rhythm of life, it was older, the rhythm of formation, of descent, of silence growing heavy enough to sing, because time, real time, the kind that endures beyond perception, is not marked by what happens. It is marked by what is kept, and the Hadean kept everything. Each isotope, in its quiet decay, left fingerprints in the crust, a ratio, a residue, a record of the exact moment. When possibility began to become pattern, thorium whispered to lead, uranium whispered to helium, potassium whispered to argon, and in those whispers, the Earth began to understand that time could be counted, without clocks. That memory could be written, without words. These were the first archives, not of life, but of becoming, and they were buried deep, not lost, folded beneath lava plains, beneath boiling oceans, beneath the weight of time itself, because time does not vanish. It simply sinks until it becomes indistinguishable from the silence it rests in. Even the moon, our silver ghost, recorded time, not in its light, but in its distance. Each year, it drifted a little farther. Each century, the tides stretched a little longer, and in that slow retreat, another rhythm formed. Day lengthened, night deepened, Earth's spin began to slow, and as it slowed, it softened into a planet that could begin to carry memory. The scars of impact remained, immense, invisible now, buried beneath newer stone, but their echoes shaped the crust. And the crust, in turn, shaped how the planet cooled, because cooling is not the absence of heat, it is the release of what once raged. The Earth released, through black smokers, on the seafloor, through spreading ridges, through subduction zones not yet stable. Heat escaped and left behind the quiet breath of geochemistry. And geochemistry, over time, became the architecture of memory, not in organs, in rocks, in olivine and feldspar, in zircon and apatite. These were the books of the Hadean. No titles, no spines, just pages of pressure weathered by decay. To read them now requires fire and physics, but in the Hadean they required nothing, only time, and time was abundant. It fell not from sky, but from isotope, not in bursts, but in breath. The Earth inhaled it, held it, let it steep, and in that steeping became something new, something slow, something sacred, a planet not yet living, but already remembering. A world without eyes, watching itself unfold, in silence. The oldest truths are not loud, they are buried, not beneath history, but beneath geology, not beneath events, but beneath intervals. The Earth in the Hadean did not mark anniversaries. It knew no beginnings, no ends, only durations, only decay, only the slow settling of heat into quiet, because time, when left alone, does not construct, it condenses, it presses itself into matter until matter becomes memory. And the memory, silent, invisible, waits. It waited in crystal, in crust, in isotopic murmurs no ear could catch. It waited in layers, so deep that even now, when the world hums with cities, those memories still sleep beneath the feet of civilizations, and in those dreams, Earth was never still. Motion persisted, not in rivers or tectonics, but in the slow exhale of planetary breath, the breath of cooling, of contraction, of internal seas, becoming solid. The outer core churned, a chaos of molten metal, too hot to crystallize, too dense to rise. and as it churned, it whispered magnetic fields into the space beyond the crust, not yet stable, not yet protective, but beginning, because even in the Hadean, the Earth was learning how to hold its breath against the solar wind. The solar wind, relentless, carrying the fury of a young star, struck the Earth again and again. It peeled at the upper atmosphere, scattered particles, erased skies, before they had a chance to settle. But even that erasure was recorded in noble gases, in isotope ratios of xenon and argon. The wind did not just take, it left clues. And the clues, those faintest traces, were time. Time made legible only through the art of not forgetting. Because the Earth, even in its rawness, did not forget. It simply hid, and hiding is not the same as loss. It is storage. It is reverence. It is patience so profound it spans eons, without needing recognition. And so the planet held on, to every decay, to every mineral birth, to every subducted plate fragment, dragged downward into the mantle's molten mouth. Even the crust, thin, fragile, ever-shifting, was becoming a memory keeper, not through survival. Through erosion, rain, though acidic and cruel, wore the surface down, and the sediments, those broken pieces of story, collected in deep basins at the ocean's floor. Each grain, a phrase, each layer, a paragraph, unread, unwritten, but real, because time, in sediment, is not motion, it is accumulation. It gathers slowly, in silence, in pressure, in absence, and absence, held long enough, becomes presence. So, the Hadean did not rush. It composed, it compiled, it cooled, and in cooling, it began the long, slow process of inheritance. Not the inheritance of blood, but of chemistry, of isotopes passed downward, of ratios preserved through eons of decay, of stones that carried memory without knowing they did. And memory, when folded deep enough, becomes time. Not time that passes, time that settles, time that seeps, time that holds. The Hadean held it all, not to understand, not to predict, only to keep. Because to keep is the first act of becoming, and the Earth, with no witness but itself, was becoming a keeper of time. The sky, still heavy with haze and sulfur light, was beginning to change, not in colour, in character. The endless veil of gases, once thick with carbon, methane, hydrogen, and grief, began to whisper something softer. It was not yet breathable, it was not yet kind, but it was less violent, less absolute. The rains came, less searing now, more steady, and with them, sediment, grains of broken rock, washed down from proto-mountains, settling into ancient ocean basins, like time falling through water. Each grain, a moment. Each layer, a silence. Because silence, when pressed into sediment, becomes a scripture of stillness. The ocean floor, though unseen, was becoming the archive of all that had happened, and all that might. Beneath miles of water, a slow geologic library was forming, not with words, with weight, the weight of minerals shifted by windless weather, the weight of dust dragged by acidic rain, the weight of absence pressed into presence, and time was the author. But time, in this place, had no pen. It wrote with erosion, with layering, with decay, and the earth, young, ancient, alone, held every page. Even the deepest sediments carried whispers of events that no eye would ever see, impacts, tides, the soft hiss of a world cooling beneath its own memory. And in the crust, radioactive isotopes continued their slow unravelling, their half-lives ticking down like breaths in stone. Uranium to lead, thorium to radium, potassium to argon, each decay a clock, each ratio a time capsule. There was no urgency, only accuracy, because decay does not forget. It continues, quietly, Precisely, and in continuing, it leaves behind a perfect map of its own disappearance. This was how time settled into Earth's body, through disappearance, through becoming less, through giving itself away until only memory remained. The surface changed, the air thinned, the heat softened, and the Earth, still without name, began to glow less and hold more, hold its scars, hold its shifts, hold the quiet story of a planet. Learning to remember, the days grew longer, the spin slowed, the tides, pulled by the ever-retreating moon, etched patterns into the seas, and those patterns, repeated for millions of years, began to fold time into rhythm, because rhythm, given enough solitude, becomes structure, and structure is the beginning of meaning. The Earth was not aware of what it held, but it held it still, in every isotope, in every layer, in every silence that refused to be erased. Time had not passed. It had deepened, like breath into lungs that had never yet drawn air, like warmth into stone that had never yet known cold. It settled, and in settling, it stayed. There was no ceremony, no edge where the Hadean ended, and something else began. No sunrise, no song, no voice saying, now, only continuation, only pressure, only the long drift, from rawness to rhythm. And in that drift, the planet became quieter, not still, but steadier, not peaceful, but patterned. Time, which once exploded outward, in impacts, in eruptions, in isotopic fire, had learned to spiral inward, to coil, to compress, to become something more than a series of vanishings. It became sediment, it became mantle convection, it became the ratio of lead to what had once been uranium. It became a trail, so subtle, so sacred, that only the most patient silence could read it. The crust, though ever-changing, held on to the oldest pieces, like a hand that refuses to release a name. Those pieces, tiny, damaged, worn by eons, remained. Zircons in Jack Hills, minerals in Achelia, ghosts in stone that had outlived their sky. Inside them, hydrogen isotopes told of water. Ratios spoke of temperatures, too low to be chaos. And for the first time, we know the Earth was ready to cradle more than heat. It was ready to remember softly, because time, when it is no longer violent, becomes sacred. It becomes layered, not in order, but in depth. And the Hadean, that first great hush, had gifted the Earth its deepest layers, not layers of rock, layers of silence, of witness, of waiting. Time did not pass. It settled, it thickened, like ash in a forgotten room. It gathered, like mist between branches. It rested, like memory, beneath the mind that forgot it. And in resting, it held the shape of all that might come. Because memory is not what we recall, it is what we carry. And the Earth, by the end of the Hadean, was carrying everything, every collision, every isotope, every whisper of rain, on stone once too hot to hold it. It carried the ghost of the moon's birth, the weight of its own slow breath, the trace of every fire that had tried to become form. And it carried the first potential, the potential not for life, but for the conditions that would one day remember how to begin it. Time had taught the Earth how to hold, how to last, how to endure without knowing why. And this is how time began. Not with motion, but with stillness. Not with light, but with erosion. Not with story, but with stone. Because time does not pass. It does not fly. It does not flee. It settles. And once it has settled, it waits. Beneath oceans, within minerals, inside the heart of stars and planets alike, for something to notice. Before the world knew edges, before coastlines curled their fingers around land, before the sky chose a colour, there was only water, and not water, not the blue we know, not the shimmer of horizon, but a sea that did not end, because it had never begun. It had no shore, No frame, no boundary where it could reflect itself. It was vast, but not infinite. It was present, but unmeasured. It was the breath of hydrogen and oxygen, bound in darkness, boiled into shape, then cooled by the long patience of a planet learning silence. This ocean was not born all at once. It arrived in sighs, in pulses, in collisions that brought water from space, and in vapour that lifted from the molten core, and fell again, and again, as acid rain, into the waiting hollows. It was not rain that nourished. It was rain that carved, that scoured, that erased. Each drop a memory, too young to mean anything, but falling anyway. Falling like sleep, falling like beginnings do, uncertain and slow. And when the falling stopped, or slowed enough to notice, the seas had gathered, thick, dark, heavy with metal and mineral. They boiled in places, in others they calmed, only because there was no wind yet to disturb them, no continents to catch them, no life to listen, only the tides dragged by a moon, still so near. It loomed like a second earth in the sky. But even the sky was not yet sky. It was a veil, a burden of gases exhaled from fire, a haze of sulfur, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, no oxygen, no stars, only colourless heat wrapped around the world like a fevered dream. And through that dream, light struggled to enter. Sunlight, diffused and blood-red, fell sideways through the murk, not in beams, but in sighs. There was no blue, there was no breath, only the silence of depth and the soft hissing of gases, still deciding whether to stay. The sea and the sky did not yet speak to one another. They existed side by side, like strangers in the same room, who do not yet know. They are part of the same story, but already something between them was stirring. At the edges, where heat escaped, where chemistry began to rearrange, a new rhythm formed. Not life, not yet, but the possibility of interaction. Minerals dissolved, elements collided, currents began to shape themselves without need of wind, and, in the deepest vents, where the crust still bled heat, into the base of the sea, black chimneys exhaled ancient breath, hydrothermal, ancestral, alien. They spewed water not from above, but from below, superheated, rich with iron and sulphur, drifting up into the cold, like ghosts. No eyes watched, no gills flared, but something was listening, something molecular, something patient, because the sea, though empty, was attentive. It held everything that had been washed from stone, everything that had dissolved. From the sky, everything that had arrived on meteors and comet ice and cosmic debris, and it swirled them together in a cradle that had no name. This was not a moment. This was a mood that lasted millions of years. And the earth, quiet now, cooling still, let the waters hold it. Let the ocean press against its skin like a memory that had not yet happened. A sea without shore, a sky without name, and between them a silence, almost ready to break. The ocean did not sleep, it did not speak. It breathed, but not in lungs, in layers. At the surface, warmth, diffuse, metallic, touched by what little light could press through the sky's fevered veil. Below that, darkness, not black, weightless, endless. A cold that was not absence, but presence, thick, observing. It held the minerals, washed from mountains that had no name, washed from rain that had no mercy. Iron, silica, magnesium, sulphur. They spun in silent spirals, waiting for pattern, waiting for accident to become structure. And at the sea's floor, a heat not from above, but from within. The mantle still whispered through fissures and faults. Hydrothermal vents breathed in steady pulses, exhaling chemical hymns. Into the deep, no sound travelled far, but even silence has a shape. The ocean listened. The sky above was still too thick to see stars. Its clouds were tar black, its rains oily with carbon, its winds slow and strange, but it had begun to lighten, not in colour, in burden. Some gases had escaped into the upper atmosphere, brushed away by the young sun's solar wind. Others had been drawn downward, dissolved into the ocean's aching body, locked in minerals that settled on the seafloor like silted dreams. And so the sky began to change, not all at once, over centuries, over silence, over the settling of memory, into air. A balance, delicate, dangerous, was emerging, between sea and sky, between breath and stone, between the possibility of future and the weight of what had already passed. The moon pulled at this ocean, as it always had, but now there was resistance. The sea answered, not in waves, but in motion, tides, currents, rhythms that rocked the crust, like lullabies in slow gravity. And with each pull, each push, the ocean stirred. In its stirring, minerals met. Molecules danced, not once, not suddenly, but endlessly. Hydrocarbons began to form, chains of carbon and hydrogen, the architecture of potential. They floated, drifted, clung to clay particles and surfaces of stone. They broke apart, reformed. Some dissolved, some stayed. They did not know what they were becoming, but they were becoming, because the sea was not just water, it was laboratory, it was memory, it was dream, and dreams do not move in straight lines. They eddy, they shimmer, they return. Above, the sky grew less cruel. Its clouds thinned just enough to let the red-orange light filter deeper. There was still no blue, no stars, but something resembling dusk now touched the horizon. And dusk, even without eyes to behold it, is always a promise that change is not only possible, it is already happening. The sea knew this, not in mind, in motion. Every current was a question, every vent a whisper, every tide a hand reaching through time. No continents yet broke the surface, only islands of stone, fleeting, built by lava and swallowed by the sea. But even these left their minerals behind, and the ocean remembered, in salt, in pressure, in temperature gradients that spiraled like breath. This was not life, but it was not nothing. It was not silence, but it was not yet sound. It was the echo before the voice, the canvas before the pigment, the waiting before the becoming. And earth, no longer molten, no longer wild, but still so young, held all of it, not to control, not to understand, only to carry. A sea without shore, a sky without name, and the quiet, haunting feeling that soon something would stir. In the deepest hours of the planet's first stillness, there was no knowing, only motion, only mineral, only the slow pulse of something not yet alive, learning how to breathe without breath. There were no beginnings, only continuations, only accidents, becoming patterns, becoming laws. The ocean held the memory of everything that had ever fallen into it. Raindrops heavy with carbon, ash from distant volcanoes, fragments of space-borne stone carrying chemicals too shy for heat. It held them all, stirred them, softened them, listened. At the floor of the sea, chimneys of black stone continued to rise from the vents, not tall, not permanent, but steady, each one an altar to the invisible. Hot fluids hissed through their mouths, saturated with ions and ancient instructions. Around them, the first boundaries, not cells, not walls, but membranes formed by chemistry alone, fragile as soap, persistent as gravity. They formed and collapsed. Again, again. Some lasted longer, some folded inwards, trapping the warm breath of minerals inside. And for a moment, a flicker, structure held, not thought, not spirit, but shape, and shape, when kept, is the beginning of memory, not in mind, but in matter. The sea had begun to write, not in letters, but in loops, not in words, but in folds, folds of molecules, twisting back on themselves, echoing one another, in rhythm, so slow. It looked like stillness, but it was not still. Nothing ever truly is. Even in the darkness, where no sunlight reached, there was motion. Even in the silence, where no sound could travel, there was resonance. Even in the cold, where heat was scarce, there was memory. Because temperature is not absence, it is decision. It tells the molecules how to move, and they moved, just enough, just long enough, to collide, to couple, to split, to begin again. There were no rules yet, only tendencies, only preferences. But even preference, given enough repetition, becomes principle. And from principle, possibility blooms. Above, the sky thinned further. Vast storms began to break, not into sunshine, into gaps, into places where the red glow of the sun could strike the surface of the sea without burning it. The clouds began to drift, slowly, not from wind, but from surrender. They had released so much of their water, and that water, collected, pooled, cooled, now covered most of the earth. The blue had not yet come. The light had not yet cleared, but the veil was lifting, not fast, but enough for shadows to form, enough for light to bend, enough for time to begin imagining change. The planet turned, a full rotation every few hours. Days were brief, nights were brief, but both were different now. Night no longer meant fire, day no longer meant suffocation. They meant rhythm, they meant difference. And difference is how memory begins to organize. The tides pressed forward, the currents curled inward. The moon, still close, still vast, pulled against the sea like a hand shaping clay, and the sea, obedient and wild, responded, with motion, with chemistry, with the faintest outlines of repetition. This was not life, not yet, but it was the breath before breath, the shape before name, the rhythm before music, a sea without shore, a sky without name, and in the trembling space between them, the first almost, the first maybe, the first sacred drift toward yes. There were no eyes to see it, but the world had begun to shimmer, not with beauty, with becoming. Light, once lost in the sky's thick sorrow, now danced faintly on the tips of waves. The water still boiled in places, still carried metals like burdens, still hissed with vented breath. But it was changing. The sky, thinning by grief and gravity alike, let the red glow filter further each day, not bright, not clear, but deeper. And in that depth, light met matter, not briefly, intimately. Photons scattered through molecules, pressing against fragile formations of carbon and nitrogen, whispering instructions only chemistry could understand. There was no speech, only possibility. And the sea, that formless cathedral, listened. In shallow pools, near volcanic coasts, where the tide boiled at noon and cooled by starlight, the first loops of structure curled tighter. They were not alive, but they moved. And movement, when repeated, is a kind of yearning, the yearning of molecules to become more than accident. There were clay beds, thin, sticky, layered by tides, that did not know they were shaping anything, and in those beds, molecules gathered, adhered, arranged. They folded against the pressure, unfolded against the heat. They twisted, not with design, but with insistence. And the twisting held, even briefly, even imperfectly. But anything that holds can remember. And the first memory, even if fleeting, is the first step toward mind, though no mind existed, only matter, curving toward complexity. Deep in the ocean, hydrothermal chimneys continued to breathe. They exhaled sulfides and heat and ancient hope, and around them the same loops appeared. Enclosed spaces, bubbles of chemistry, unstable membranes that flickered in and out, of cohesion. Some broke, some lingered, some caught within them, strange spirals of chain-bound molecules that when warmed, replicated, not life, but rhythm, not soul, but echo. The ocean held these echoes, as it held everything, not tightly, lovingly, because to hold is not to possess, it is to allow, to shelter, to offer time, without asking for outcome. And time, true time, was abundant. It curved through the sea, like a second current. It folded around chimneys and tide pools. It curled beneath rafts of crust, thin as dreams. And in that folding, everything was changing. Carbon met phosphorus. Nitrogen kissed sulfur. Chains grew, split, grew again. The sea was not a womb. It was a threshold, a place between nowhere and not yet, between fire and form, between the past that could not return and the future that had not yet found its voice. Above, the moon continued its retreat, no longer the ruler of tides, but their composer. Its pull slowed the spin of the planet. Days stretched, nights deepened. The sky began to cool. Clouds grew gentler, rain more steady, no longer acid. Now soft, at times even quiet. And that quiet spoke, not in sound, in space. Space for molecules to meet, to gather, to dance in tidal shallows. There, in those sunlit, skin-deep places, the loops grew longer. Some broke, some held, some repeated. They did not know what they were, but they continued, because continuation is the first sacred act, and Earth, still young, still nameless, was now a stage for sacred acts, not miracles, motions that, over time, became memory, and memory, given silence, became possibility. Still, the sea had no shore. No continent had yet risen to draw a line between water and land, but in places, proto-islands stirred, cratonic fragments floated on the mantle, like crusted dreams. They broke the surface for only moments. But even moments can change chemistry. In their shade, in their runoff, in their protection, new pockets of water formed, ponds, shallows, warmed not by depth, but by light. And in that warmth, loops multiplied. Some even adapted, not to survive. To continue, survival did not yet exist. Only persistence, only the quiet law that anything which echoes long enough may one day become a voice. And in those silent, sacred waters, the first syllables of that voice were curling, invisible, toward being. The ocean had no word for itself. It simply was. It moved, it held, it echoed. It did not seek. It allowed. And from this allowing, the foundations of story began to take shape, not in sentences, not even in thoughts, but in structure. The structures grew complex. They folded, they looped, they built scaffolds of reaction that reached toward the sacred blur between matter and meaning. Some formed inside rock pores, near the sea's breathless vents. Some in shallow pools, warmed by sunlight and cooled by starlight. Some drifted in the wide belly of the ocean, finding companions, by chance, by proximity, by the quiet yearning to persist. These forms were not alive, but they flirted with the threshold. They changed. They responded. They remembered, if only briefly. And memory, however small, is enough. Enough for time to notice. Enough for chemistry to pause, to breathe, to hesitate before erasing. The earth had become a vessel for that hesitation. A pause so long it stretched into possibility. Because life does not begin like a spark. It begins like a hush, like a stillness, so complete. It invites structure to sing, and structure had begun to hum. There were compartments now, tiny ones, bound by lipids, or minerals, or accident. Within them, molecules met, reacted, copied, not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. Enough for variation, enough for the first hint of difference. And difference is the root of memory. of identity, of that which says, I am not the same as before. Still, no cell had yet formed, no heartbeat, no thought, but everything required was in place. The cycles, the molecules, the rhythms, the earth had written its preface in ash, in ocean, in time that settled, not forward, but downward, into stone, into silence, into the sea. Above, the sky cleared further. It was not blue, it was not kind, but it was honest. Clouds moved with purpose. The sun warmed more steadily. The wind's light as breath began to shape the surface. It rained, and the water no longer carved, with violence, but with patience. And beneath that rain, the ocean did what it had always done, held every fragment, every mineral, every forgotten heat. From the vents below, it held the long ache of cooling rock and the soft repetition of forming loops. It held the whispers of tides that did not know. They were writing the world's first lullaby. And in that lullaby, life did not appear, but it hovered like fog on the edge of land that has not yet risen, like sound inside the throat of a being not yet born, like memory in the hands of a planet that had learned to listen. And the earth did listen, through every grain of sediment, through every shift in salinity, through every flicker of chemistry that refused to vanish, because vanishing, when resisted, becomes staying, and staying, over time, becomes becoming. So the planet held its sea, the sea held its sky, and between them, the space where story was beginning to root, not in voice, not in form, but in rhythm, the rhythm of repetition, the rhythm of resistance, the rhythm of rain, falling into a pond and striking the same stone for 1,000,000 years, without tiring. There was still no shore, there was still no name, but there was presence, and presence, held long enough, becomes identity, and identity, even without thought, even without cell, is the beginning of something sacred. So the Hadean waters, formless, restless, cradled that beginning, not as a parent, as a witness, because the earth, before it bore life, was first a witness, a keeper of silent almosts, a vessel for sacred patience, a sea without shore, a sky without name, and between them, the ache of what was coming. Silence is not emptiness, it is architecture, a structure carved not from absence, but from waiting. And in the Hadean Eon, silence was the only language. The earth knew how to speak. It spoke in subduction, in magma, in the heavy hush of radioactive breath. It spoke through folding, not of cloth, but of continents unborn. The silence folded itself into the bones of the planet, into the seams of its crust, where heat and pressure met, not in fury, but in memory. This memory did not resemble thought. It resembled geology, and geology, when stripped of scale, is the study of patience. Silence is patient. It does not demand. It settles. It waits. It listens for the weight of time to make sense of itself. And in the Hadean, time had begun to weigh more than motion. The earth no longer burned blindly. It burned inward. Mantle plumes rose, not as chaos, but as rhythm. Crust sank, not in defeat, but in surrender. Surrender to gravity, to heat, to the burden of cooling. And as the crust folded, it carried silence with it, folded into granite, folded into gneiss, folded into the mineral breath of rocks that would outlive oceans. These folds were not fractures, they were cradles. They held stories that no mouth would speak, no script would trace. Because not all stories are told, some are kept. And the earth, layer by layer, was becoming a keeper. Every layer of crust was a moment buried. Every subducted slab, a sentence sealed, not lost, not erased, only hidden. Because silence is not a blankness, it is a veil. And beneath that veil, the oldest truths continue breathing. The rocks once molten, now mineral, were no longer shapeless. They were structured, they had grain, they had direction, they had been pressed beneath the weight of their own memory until they held a kind of alignment. Metamorphic, sacred, pressure turned them, heat reformed them, time taught them how to last, and in lasting, they became language. The language of folds, of layers, of minerals aligned like thoughts beneath centuries of sleep. There were no books, no tablets, no fossils, only stone that carried silence, with more devotion than any priest ever could. And that silence, that sacred hush, was not still. It moved, deep beneath the crust, in tectonic murmurs. There was no plate tectonics, as we know it. Not yet, not fully, but the prelude had begun. Crust formed, cooled, cracked, sank. The mantle recycled what it was given, not cruelly, but thoroughly, and in that recycling, the crust became both memory and offering. Even the oldest zircons, those crystalline archivists, were born of this cycle, formed in magma that passed through countless transformations, carried in rocks that rose and fell, lifted by heat, buried by gravity, and inside them a silence so dense it became truth, not the truth of events, the truth of presence, the truth that says, I was here, I endured, I remember. And so the silence endured, not because it was empty, but because it was full, full of pressure, full of mineral, full of every moment. The earth chose to fold inward instead of break apart, because folding in the language of stone is how love survives, not loud, not bright, but buried, held, carried into futures that do not yet speak its name. And the earth, silent still, was carrying that love beneath its skin, beneath oceans, beneath vents, beneath the forming continents, still unborn in the dark. The silence that folded itself into stone would become the stage on which every story would stand. But first, it had to last, and lasting is the hardest part of becoming. The earth was not speaking, but it was listening to itself, and what it heard was weight. The weight of heat beneath crust too thin to rest. The weight of oceans pressed down upon stone, still unsure of its shape. The weight of silence, thick as time, gathering in the folds of everything that did not erupt. Not all fire is flame. Some burns inward, soft and slow. This was the Hadean fire now. It flickered through the mantle, not in rage, but in memory. It traced the paths of former collisions, travelled the wounds, left by the moon's birth, slid along the fractures of crustal rafts, rising and falling, like breath, and through that breath the silence deepened. In the crust, minerals aligned. In pressure, they turned. In heat, they reformed, not destroyed, changed. Gneiss, schist, amphibolite, rocks that had been and would be again, but always altered, always folded, always more than they were before. This was not evolution. It was remembering. The earth was becoming a body of memory, not the kind held in thoughts, but the kind etched into form. Every stone, a journal of heat, every layer, a breath caught mid-collapse, every fold, a page turned by gravity's patient hand. There were no continents, not yet, but there were seeds, cratonic roots, fragments of protoland that refused to sink, no matter how the mantle pulled. They floated, not like islands, like oaths, ancient promises, made of granite and held beneath the waves. And in their holding, they changed the ocean's shape. They created currents, eddies, shadows where chemistry could rest. And chemistry, like silence, requires stillness to deepen. In the shelter of these rocks, the first fragile membranes could last longer. The first molecular loops could repeat more freely. Not yet cells, but close. Not yet life, but no longer chance. The silence held it all, not as jailer, as steward, because the silence of stone does not trap, It contains, it cradles, it says, stay as long as you need, change as slowly as you must. And the earth obeyed. It changed slowly. Its mantle pulsed in deep convective cycles. Its crust cracked, healed, cracked again. Islands rose, flickered, vanished. Basins deepened. Seawater cooled. Each change recorded, not in headlines, but in grains. Grains that settled, sank, were buried, and pressed into pages, beneath layers of other buried things. The first sedimentary rocks were forming: shale, grey-wacke, banded ironstone, compressed silence, the memory of oceans, held between layers, as thin as dreams. They lay unmoving for eons, waiting not to be found, but simply to be, because being, when held that long, becomes sacred, and the earth had become sacred, not because of life, but because of silence, the silence that allowed pressure to shape, that allowed time to remain, that allowed heat to whisper instead of roar. And in that whispering, the crust began to thicken, to hold together just long enough for geology to become memory instead of chaos. The earth was no longer a firestorm. It was a keeper of folds, of layers, of slow unbreaking things. And those things, invisible, buried, were shaping everything that would follow. Every ocean had a flaw, every flaw had a seam, and every seam was a silence folded inward until it became stone. The world was learning how to hold still, not in stasis, in structure. The silence that filled the Hadean was not a pause. It was a process, the long, slow ceremony of becoming stable enough to be uncertain, because stability, true stability, is what allows for the unpredictable to begin. And the earth, folded in upon itself, was approaching that threshold. The crust, formed in fire, carried the signature of everything. It had survived. Each rock, each grain, held temperatures, soaked into their lattice, pressures that etched new alignments. Some minerals forgot, some retained. Zircon remembered best. It crystallized in molten pockets, survived the grinding of mountains, the subduction of plates, the boiling breath of vents, and inside each crystal, tiny, ancient, near invisible, were isotopes that told time by dissolving themselves. Lead where there had been uranium, helium where there had been thorium, ratios written not in ink, but in decay, in loss, in transmutation, and that loss, so slow, so sacred, became the most faithful record of the Hadean's breath. Each zircon, a grain of silence, folded so deeply it could not be erased, and it was in silence that the crust began to float, not weightlessly, but buoyantly. It was less dense than the mantle, and in time, the roots of ancient cratons began to press upward, lifting islands of stone through the dark ocean. These were not continents, not yet, but they stayed. Unlike the fleeting volcanic rafts before them, these fragments endured. They withstood erosion, resisted subduction, cradled sediment where rain could fall, and tides could linger. And in these pools, these shallows, kissed by starlight and vent heat alike, chemistry continued. Its sacred rehearsals, rehearsals for breath, for replication, for the impossible bridge between molecule and memory. Still no life, but the steps toward it were forming grooves, and grooves, given enough repetition, become pathways. The earth was full of such pathways, some carved by rivers, not yet visible, some pressed into stone by the weight of mountains, forming slowly beneath the sea. Some were molecular, tiny cycles of energy that looped through carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, like lullabies no ear would ever hear, and all of them were folded into the silence. Because silence, true silence, is not the absence of song, it is the condition in which song becomes possible. The mantle turned, slow and steady in its churning breath. The crust rose and sank. Rain fell, and minerals flowed from stone into the sea's dark belly. Nothing rushed, everything moved, and movement, held within the quiet, became language, not spoken, encoded, a language of transformation, the language of the Hadean, folded into stone. And even now, billions of years later, it speaks, not to the ears, to the instruments, to the minds, still willing to listen, to the geologists who read ratios as if they were scripture, to the dreamers who look at a rock and hear the hush of an ocean that has long since forgotten its name, because some silences do not end, they simply change shape. And the silence of the Hadean was still echoing, not forward, but inward, in every layer, in every folded seam, in every pressure-borne crystal that refused to forget how the world began. What the earth buried, it did not abandon. It folded, pressed deep beneath its skin, held in layers so still, so quiet, they became eternal. The Hadean silence was not erased. It was transformed. It became mineral. It became alignment. It became the quiet pressure beneath every mountain yet to rise. And in its deepest places, the earth kept listening to the subduction zones, pulling crust into mantle, slow as prayer, to the isotopes, writing time into stone with their disappearing breath, to the sediments, gathering in soft layers, each grain a silence laid gently on top of another, and still no voice, still no breath, no cell, no thought. But the scaffolding was in place. All that would one day live would rest upon this silence, would feed on these minerals, would carry these isotopic echoes in bone, in blood, in memory, because memory, even in life, is inherited from stone, not in stories, in elements. The iron in blood was once in rock, pressed beneath oceans, older than light. The calcium in bone was once in the crust, before the crust had shape, and the carbon, the ghost at the heart of all becoming, cycled through vents and sea, long before it touched a single strand of thought. The silence that folded itself into stone was never empty. It was preparation, a space made sacred by waiting, and what waited there was not life. It was time, time curled in zircon, time pressed in shale, time breathed through black smokers, and beneath protocontinents, asleep beneath waves. It folded into metamorphic rock, in tight crystalline lines, each one an echo of pressure endured and endured again. It folded into sedimentary stone, in soft repetitions of silt and ash and erosion, left behind by tides that didn't know they were shaping futures. And it folded into igneous granite, frozen fire, that cooled slowly enough to remember its heat. These three stones, igneous, metamorphic, sedimentary, were the voices of silence, the ways the earth learned to hold without speaking, to change without forgetting, to endure without expecting witness. The silence was not a blankness, it was a foundation. Upon it, everything would rise. The first cells, tiny, trembling, unaware, would root themselves in the minerals of this silence. The first metabolisms would feed on its chemistry. The first consciousness would echo its rhythm, because silence, when folded into stone, becomes more than pause. It becomes promise. And the earth, long before life, long before thought, made this promise in pressure and grain. It said, I will remember. What the fire forgets, I will carry. What the wind cannot, I will hold. What is too fragile for light, and it did, it still does. In every cliff face that shows its layers, like a sleeping book. In every canyon that whispers depth, in sediment and shadow. In every mountain that bends its spine to the folding force of time. The earth does not forget. It folds, and in that folding, the Hadean silence was never lost. It was only waiting. Not all fire burns with flame. Some fire whispers, some fire forgets. And the fire of the Hadean earth, that deep, unending breath, was learning how to become memory, not in smoke, not in heat, in isotopes, fragments of atoms, torn from their perfect balance, drifting through the crust, changing, decaying, becoming something new, in slow, sacred unraveling. This was not destruction. This was a clock that ticked, not by movement, but by loss, not by gears, but by disappearance. The parent atom gives way to its child. Uranium becomes lead. Potassium becomes argon. Thorium unthreads itself into silence. Each transformation measured not in seconds, but in half-lives. The half-life, not the end, but the middle of forgetting, where time isn't lost, but divided, portioned, laid gently across millennia, like ash falling on a calm sea. These atoms, these fire-born keepers, held inside them a kind of intelligence, not thought, not will, but order, a consistency, more faithful than memory. They decayed, whether watched or not, whether held in crystal or scattered in vapor. They became because they could not remain. And in that becoming, time was made traceable. The earth, still wild with change, held these isotopes as gifts, as instruments, as holy embers of the stars that came before, because every radioactive atom was forged in collapse, in the death of giants, supernovae that tore themselves apart to make gold, to make uranium, to make the heavy bones of all things that endure. And Earth, coalesced from that ash, carried their legacy into its core, into its crust, into every crystal that cooled slowly enough to hold a whisper. This was the forgotten fire, not the fire of lava or lightning, but the fire of decay, of transition, of time measured in silence. No flame rose from it, no smoke marked its presence, but it warmed the earth from within, radiogenic heat, a steady breath beneath the crust. The mantle convected because these atoms decayed. The continents floated because these atoms warmed the rock beneath them. Without isotope, no heat. Without heat, no movement. Without movement, no memory. Because memory requires motion. It requires the stirring of what would otherwise sleep. And so the earth stirred. It turned itself in slow, molten spirals. It cracked its crust and sealed it again. It let magma rise where pressure demanded and let ocean fall into trenches carved by gravity's hand. Each of these motions was made possible by decay, by fire that never burned bright, only long. And still, no mind knew this. No watcher traced these patterns. But the patterns were there, in every rock that formed from cooling magma, in every mineral that locked isotopes in place, in every ratio that, when read later, would speak of years, far older than bone, because age is not a number. It is a relationship between what is and what was, between now and the unraveling of fire. And Earth, in its youth, was learning how to measure what it could not see, not with rulers, with remnants, and remnants are holy, especially those that disappear slowly, especially those that remain just long enough to leave a trail for those who one day might follow. The fire was not gone. It was simply inside, whispering beneath stone, changing without noise, becoming without praise. This was the fire. That time itself learned to follow. Time, in its earliest form, did not march forward. It unraveled, slowly, element by element. Each act of decay was a whisper into the silence of stone, a promise made and remade, not with breath, but with balance. The parent isotope, unsteady in its form, offered itself to change, not because it was forced, because change was the only way to remain. There is no permanence in this kind of fire, only persistence. Uranium became lead, but not suddenly. It paused, across half-lives, so vast, they outlasted oceans, It lingered, in zircons cooled from ancient magma, those sacred beads of memory, buried in crust, older than breath. And while it lingered, it burned, not with light, but with heat that seeped into stone. This was the quiet fuel of Earth's transformation, radiogenic warmth that turned the planet's insides like a wheel, slow, inevitable, divine. It did not flame outward. It deepened, spiraled, taught the mantle to move in convection cells, so wide no mind could hold their shape. Through this fire, plates began to drift. The crust became mobile, not swiftly, but surely, and as it moved, it remade itself, again and again. The oldest rocks were not survivors. They were remainders, left behind, only where the fire could not reach, to reclaim them. And even they held within the breath of isotope. Ratios, etched in silence, told of when they cooled, of how long they had waited, of what had decayed within them. Lead told the story of uranium, argon told the story of potassium, and every story was a countdown, a soft ticking that no ear would ever hear, only instruments, eons later, with the patience to listen. These stories were not written in order. They were layered, folded, interrupted, and like all sacred texts, they required translation. But the earth never forgot them, because the fire never truly left. It only settled deeper, lower, until it became the breath of the core itself. Still now, beneath every continent, beneath every sea, the isotopes decay. Still now, the fire continues, and through it, the planet moves, not just physically, spiritually. Each act of decay, a meditation on impermanence. Each transformation, a lesson in how to stay. By changing, even now, the warmth that keeps, the mantle alive, the dynamo spinning, the crust in motion, all of it is powered by forgetting, by atoms losing their names, and in losing, becoming something that time can hold. There is a holiness to this fire, not because it destroys, but because it transforms in silence. And silence is where all sacred things are born. In the Hadean, this fire was constant. It did not rise. It remained. It did not ask. It offered. And the earth, in its earliest knowing, took the gift and learned to move, to fold, to remember, to age. Because age, in geology, is not wear. It is presence. And presence, held in isotope and stone, is how fire becomes memory. The oldest stories the earth has ever told were whispered through isotopes. Before language, before light, before lungs knew how to hold a breath, there were no listeners, only witnesses, only rocks, becoming time, because the fire did not need an audience. It only needed space to change. It changed within the crust, where uranium slowly crumbled into lead, where thorium, proud and steady, shed its form, grain by grain, where potassium, humble in its commonness, transformed into argon gas and floated upward, waiting to be trapped in a pocket of stone. Each act of decay was both death and birth, a letting go and a becoming, and the earth, ancient even in its youth, became a library of these unspoken transitions. Each isotope, a sentence, each ratio, a rhythm, each layer of rock, a page pressed down by the weight of time and sealed with gravity's soft hand. Zircons kept these stories best. They crystallized in the final exhale of magma when the heat had cooled just enough for atoms to choose order. In that stillness, uranium slipped inside. A quiet passenger, invisible, unwelcome to the lattice, but accepted anyway. And so the zircon carried it, and the uranium decayed, and the zircon endured, through fire, through erosion, through burial, through the weight of oceans, and the folding of mountains, and the breaking of continents that had not yet been imagined. Some of these zircons survive still, tiny, unassuming, older than the moon's tides, older than the sky's breath. They rest now in ancient stones, like Jack Hill's, Australia, grains of time, smaller than a thought, but older than thought itself. Inside them, scientists find lead. Not just any lead, a lead with a past, a lead that remembers. It was once uranium, a lead that tells, without voice, how many years it has carried silence. And by listening, we know. We know when the crust cooled. We know when the seas formed. We know that even in fire, something sacred was already settling, because even chaos leaves fingerprints. And radioactive decay, this slow elemental exhale, was how the earth marked its early breath, without calendars, without clocks, only with forgetting. But forgetting, in the Hadean, was not loss. It was recording. Each isotope that surrendered its form left behind a trail of memory too precise to erase, and the planet, in its wordless wisdom, folded these memories into crystal, into crust, into every mineral that cooled slowly enough to hold a secret. This was the true fire, the forgotten fire. It didn't flicker. It didn't blaze. It endured. It powered the engine of tectonics. It kept the core warm enough to stir iron. It helped shape the fields that would one day protect the air from solar wind. And long before life, it prepared the stage, not with drama, with rhythm, not with prophecy, with persistence, because persistence, when held in silence, becomes prophecy anyway. Even now, when we measure a rock and read its isotopes, we are not discovering. We are remembering. We are listening to what the fire has been saying since before breath, that all things change, that all things leave a trace, that, even forgetting, has a voice. If you are willing to listen with time, in the cathedral of stone, where silence weighs more than thought, the fire still moved, not in haste, never in haste, but with the grace of decay, a slow surrender of the heavy elements, into something softer, lighter, more stable. This surrender was not defeat. It was transformation. It was the planet's first act of becoming something other than violent. Not because it knew how, because the fire beneath had begun to forget its rage. And in that forgetting, it became useful. It warmed the crust from below. Let oceans stay liquid. Let stone recycle itself in plates that drifted like long, tired breaths. Each motion powered by isotope, by atoms too old to hold themselves together and too sacred to simply vanish, because nothing in this fire disappeared. It only changed its name, and change, when practiced long enough, becomes rhythm. The rhythm of the Earth's interior was now set, a mantle, no longer random, but convecting. Hot rock rose, cooled, sank again. In this spiral, continents would one day form, oceans would widen, mountains would rise. But in the Hadean, it was still just breath. Breath that never paused. Breath made of decay. And breath, even without lungs, makes presence possible. That presence gave shape to the earliest crust. Not just a skin, but a vessel for memory, held in isotope. Even the air felt the change. Volcanoes exhaled, gases born of inner fire, carbon, sulfur, water vapor, all shaped by the chemistry of what was breaking down below. The atmosphere grew not from life, but from loss, from the breath of vanishing atoms, from the sigh of an earth learning to cool, and the oceans drank that breath. They took what was given. They dissolved the carbon, settled the sulfur into seafloor sediments, swallowed the iron in waves tinted red. These oceans, so vast, so old, so heavy with chemical inheritance, they too bore the mark of radioactive fire, because fire does not remain in one place. It touches everything, especially when it forgets, especially when it lets go of heat, of form, of name. The first warmth, beneath the sea, came not from the sun, but from the decay within the crust. Hydrothermal vents cracked the ocean floor, pouring mineral-rich waters into the black. These vents were the children of isotope, of a fire too patient to flare, too steady to vanish. And near them, in that dark, in that heat, in that quiet, the first whispers of life would one day gather, not because fire created life, but because fire made room for it, by keeping the planet warm, by keeping the ocean liquid, by stirring the mantle in rhythms. Life could learn to echo, because life, when it comes, will not invent rhythm. It will inherit it, and the rhythms of fire, the half-lives, the drift of heat, the slow spirals of rising stone, these will be the cradle. But for now, there is no life. Only isotopes breaking down with dignity. Only elements telling time by letting go. Only the earth, half born, half forgetting, half remembering, breathing out heat through every stone that once carried the stars. This is the forgotten fire. Forgotten not because it failed, forgotten because it was never loud. It was always patient, always slow, always sacred, and still it burns. The fire had faded from the sky, but it still lived beneath the skin of the world, not as blaze, as breath, invisible, elemental, never still. It moved through the body of the earth as a pulse made of decay, a warmth that never called attention to itself, a whisper that shaped everything. And this whisper, this isotope-laced murmur, was the first true timekeeper, because time, without a witness, is still time, and memory, even when buried in crystal, is still memory. Each radioactive atom was a metronome, ticking away eons, with no hand to turn it. No calendar marked its hours, no shadow stretched across stone to measure its drift. Only change, only half-lives, only the silence of a parent, becoming a daughter, becoming a trace. These were the clocks that counted without ticking, the clocks that made history, long before language, the clocks that told the earth, again and again, this was a moment, and though the earth had no ears, it listened, not passively, in structure, in the curves of folded rock, in the pressure patterns that shaped metamorphic veins, deep beneath forgotten mountains, in the pockets of trapped gas that carried ratios older than oceans. This was not observation, it was embodiment. The earth became time by absorbing its fire. The isotopes did not merely exist within it, they were it. They gave it motion, heat, change. And those three things, motion, heat, change, were the first conditions from which anything could rise, even life. Eventually, but the isotopes did not wait for life. They continued their descent, their offering, their unmaking. The fires within the earth never asked to be seen. They gave without ceremony, and in doing so, they lit the long hallway through which time would walk. This hallway, this passage of isotope through matter, was the only stable thing in an unstable world. It did not fluctuate. It did not shatter. It did not bend. It simply counted. With every decay, a lesson. To change is not to die. To lose is not to end. To fall apart is sometimes the only way to become something new. And so, while the sky boiled and cleared, while the seas gathered and churned, while the crust rose and sank and rose again, the isotopes kept to their rhythm. Earth's hidden pulse, Earth's first fire, Earth's memory made from loss. And now, billions of years later, when hands lift ancient stones, when machines trace isotopic ratios, when minds lean close to zircon and hear the lead that once was uranium, they are not discovering, they are remembering. The fire was never forgotten. It was simply quiet. It was simply folded beneath everything that came after. And what is folded is not erased. It is waiting, waiting to be read, waiting to be heard, waiting to be felt again, as warmth that comes not from flame, but from time, because time, in its truest form, is fire. not bright, not consuming, but patient and eternal. This fire still lives beneath our feet. It still turns the mantle, still powers the plates, still sings its isotope song into every corner of the crust, still reminds the earth of how it began, not with explosion, but with change, not with creation, but with decay, not with noise, but with the long, sacred silence of elements becoming what they were always meant to be. Gravity is not loud. It does not shout its presence. It does not flash or crack or burn. It waits. It pulls. It gathers. And in the Hadean, gravity was still settling. It had done its first great work, the work of collapse, of drawing gas and dust into a sphere, of forging the core, of shaping the moon's birth in a fire that cracked the heavens. But now that gravity was tired, not diminished, refined, the collisions were fewer, the chaos softened, and the earth, once spun in fury, was beginning to slow, because gravity, when allowed to rest, does not vanish. It becomes rhythm, and rhythm is how stillness speaks. The moon, born of broken earth, drifted slightly farther each year. It had once clung close, a great silver wound, just above the sky. Now it pulled gently, at the tides, dragging the oceans. Through ancient breath, the earth responded. Its spin, once frantic, gradually slowed. Its days lengthened, not by decree, but by resistance, because resistance is gravity's quiet language. Each tide was a tug, each orbit an offering, and in that exchange, the earth found peace. Not the peace of still water, the peace of motion that no longer fears itself. The crust, pressed inward by its own weight, sank in places, rose in others. This was not chaos. This was balance. Balance beneath ocean. Balance beneath time. Balance in the spinning of a planet, learning how to hold itself together. Even the core, that hidden engine, spun separately, its iron breath stirring beneath mantle and crust. Gravity shaped it, kept it centered, held it close to what mattered most, motion without collapse, because collapse, though powerful, is not endurance, and the Hadean had already collapsed enough. Now it was learning how to remain, to hold, to orbit, to carry weight, not as burden, but as being. There is a place, deep in every planet, where gravity goes to sleep, not in absence, in fullness, a center, a calm, the heart of all pressure, but without push, a point so dense it does not move, and so everything moves around it. Earth had such a place, it always had, but now, in the quieting of fire, in the settling of crust, it was felt, not by creatures, not by minds, but by minerals, by tides, by silence, and silence, in the arms of gravity, does not fall. It rests. The orbit of the moon widened. The spin of Earth slowed. The tides grew more measured, more sacred, and the ocean began to know a rhythm deeper than its chemistry. It began to know gravity as lullaby, because lullabies do not need words, only repetition, only return, only the soft motion of something vast holding something small. This is what gravity became, not force, not violence, but embrace. And the earth, held in that embrace, began to breathe as a single body, not fully formed, not yet awake, but whole. The earth did not fall. It floated, not in air, in balance, held between the sun's steady pull and the moon's retreating kiss. It turned, not with urgency, but with rhythm, a rhythm inherited from collapse but refined into motion. This was the gravity that did not command. It invited, it whispered to oceans, move this way. It hummed to stone, settle here. It curled itself around the planet's mass, like memory, folding into breath. And everything obeyed, not because it must, but because there was nowhere else to go. For gravity is not a rule, it is a return, a return to center, to stillness, to the sacred weight of belonging. Even the mountains, still unborn, I felt it, their roots pressed deeper with each pulse of magma. Their peaks, weighted beneath the sea, shaped not by eruption, but by patience, because height is not rebellion, it is agreement with the pull beneath it. The earliest tectonic dances were beginning, not the sharp choreography of later eras, but slow gestures, soft collisions between floating plates, barely thicker than sleep. These protoplates, rafts of crust, adrift on a sea of heat, moved not with intent, but with memory. Memory of density, of heat beneath, of gravity above. They rose, not in defiance, but because they were lighter. They sank, not in failure, but because gravity asked them to. Even subduction, that slow swallowing of crust into the mantle's warm body, was a form of listening, listening to weight, to warmth, to the gravity that gave shape to everything without needing to be seen. And in the spaces between, basins formed, oceans deepened, the moon pulled at them with long, delicate arms, and they swayed, as if remembering a lullaby they never learned. This sway was the first true rhythm, not of life, not yet, but of repetition, of return, of water falling toward the moon without reaching it, and falling again, because gravity, when it goes to sleep, does not stop. It dreams. It dreams of circles, of spirals, of things that move without breaking away. And Earth became one of those dreams. The sun watched from a distance. Its light, still redder then, filtered through an atmosphere thick with ancient breath. But that light, diffuse and muted, helped. It warmed the surface. It fed the ocean's surface skin just enough to stir convection, just enough to help the tides become layers. And the layers became memory, because every movement that returns leaves something behind, a trail, a trace, a rhythm pressed into water and echoed in stone. Even now, those rhythms remain in tidal bulges that lag behind the moon, in the slow stretching of Earth's day, in the shape of the Earth itself, not perfectly round, but slightly swollen at the waist, because gravity, in its dreaming, remembers everything it has ever held, and it holds, gently, not like chains, but like cradle, like gravity's hands, beneath a sea, too ancient to recall its name, holding it, rocking it, letting it become whatever it would choose to be. The world did not yet know shape, but it was being shaped by nothing more than the soft insistence of gravity. Gravity never asks, it draws, it does not argue, it invites. And the earth, still glowing within, still dark above, answered that invitation. With every fold of crust, every drop of ocean, every subtle tilt of its unseen core, there were no shorelines, no valleys, no riverbeds. But already the idea of landscape was beginning to settle into motion. It began with bulge. The planet spun, and around its middle, it thickened. Not much, just enough to remember its motion, just enough for gravity to say, this is what turning feels like. That widening was a kind of scar, a soft one, a mark left not by violence, but by rhythm. It told the story of a planet trying to hold itself in balance, while spinning toward what it would one day become. And beneath this slow spin, the inner core was learning to move on its own, not as rebellion, as echo. It rotated, suspended in molten metal, a center within a center where pressure was so complete. It forgot to fall, because gravity, in the deepest heart of Earth, does not pull, it rests. That resting place, the exact center, is the only point, where everything pulls equally from all directions. A perfect pause between all becoming. And there, at the middle of all weight, gravity went to sleep, not because it was done, Because it was whole, it no longer needed to act. It could simply be. Above it, layers shifted. The mantle churned. The crust drifted. The ocean leaned toward the moon. All of it was dance. And every dance needs a still point. The earth had found hers. In the darkness, the moon continued its long goodbye. Each orbit a little wider, each tide a little slower, but still it pulled, and the ocean, obedient and infinite, moved to meet it. This was gravity's greatest miracle, not that it held planets together, but that it taught water how to sway, that it made time out of repetition, that it gave the earth a pulse, and in that pulse, the memory of silence began to learn rhythm, a cycle, a return, a pattern where none had existed before. This pattern did not yet carry life, but it was carrying possibility, because life, when it comes, must rise into a world that already knows how to hold, and gravity was teaching the earth to hold its oceans, to hold its crust, to hold its center without collapse. It was not force, it was form, and form, given time, becomes invitation, an invitation for molecules to stay, to repeat, to build, to remember, and beneath it all, that sleeping center, that quiet core, that stillness from which all motion was born. Not seen, not known, but felt by every stone, every tide, every breathless drift of mantle heat. The center did not move, and because it didn't, everything else could. This is how gravity rests. Not by stopping, by completing, it does not vanish. It becomes, and what it becomes is the cradle. And in the Hadean, amid all the heat and ash and wandering stars, that cradle was enough. The earth turned slowly, a little slower each year, as the moon whispered distance into orbit. Not farewell, but grace, a widening of space between two bodies, still bound. By rhythm, the tides obeyed. They surged and softened, crashing not in sound, but in pressure. Each tide a silent reaching, each retreat a promise to return. Because gravity never forgets. It may loosen, it may sleep, but it holds. It always holds. And in that holding, the ocean learned balance. It flowed toward the pull, then back again, its molecules taught, not by mind, but by motion. And motion, in time, became memory. Not a memory of events, but of arrangement, of pattern, of becoming. The ocean began to pulse, with more than heat. It pulsed with continuity, because to move the same way for 1,000,000 years is not repetition, it is devotion, and the earth was devoted to its spin, to its tilt, to the quiet center that asked nothing but allowed everything. Mountains had not yet risen, but their roots were already dreaming. The crust had not yet split into plates, as it would in later eons, but the breath of motion was there, in slow bulges, in softened folds, in the stretch and press of stone becoming willing, willing to move, willing to carry heat, willing to serve, the rhythm of a world turning in the arms of a sleeping force. Because gravity, when it sleeps, dreams of circles, dreams of orbits, dreams of tides and turns, and the long exhale of equilibrium. And in the Hadean, that exhale had begun. It drifted through the layers. It held the mantle in motion. It curled around the core, like a lullaby without sound, not to lull the earth to sleep, but to let it awaken, slowly, awaken to structure, to stability, to a dance that no longer needed fire to keep it turning, because now it had gravity, not as weight, but as memory. Memory made form, memory made orbit, memory made the shape of things that do not fall, because they are already held. And the earth, held in that dream, was ready, ready to carry oceans without overflowing, ready to cool without forgetting warmth, ready to bear the soft beginnings of something that had not yet begun. The silence beneath the crust was now complete. The fire beneath the mantle still stirred. The isotopes still whispered, their slow arithmetic. But above, everything had changed. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, with gravity, with the gentle insistence of motion made sacred. Because when gravity went to sleep, it did not cease. It blessed, and the earth, bathed in that blessing, carried it forward, into deeper oceans, into drifting plates, into the earliest shadows of continents to come. The world was still young, still rough, still quiet, but it was whole, and wholeness, when held by gravity, becomes foundation, not fixed, not final, but faithful, the kind of foundation upon which rhythm can rest, upon which life could one day rise, because all that lives, all that breathes, all that forgets and remembers, still leans inward, toward that sleeping centre, still turns around, that still point where gravity rests, not pulling, not shouting, but simply being, and in being makes space for everything else to move. Land did not arrive with intention. It rose, then fell, then rose again, not as continent, not as country, but as accident, as burden, as ash cooled, just long enough to hold its shape. The first crust was not strong. It was a scab on a wound that never closed, a thin raft on seas of fire, adrift in gravity's embrace. It did not know permanence. It did not hold still. It cracked. It buckled. It disappeared. And each time it sank, the earth tried again. Because form, like memory, is not granted. It is earned. Through repetition, through failure, through the quiet persistence of matter refusing to stay shapeless. The crust did not yet carry a name, because naming requires witness, and this land was seen only by the sky, by the rain, by the ocean's edge, that kissed it, then swallowed it whole. But even unspoken, it mattered, because from this fragile skin, the planet began to understand how to hold weight, how to hold water, how to hold heat without bursting. It thickened, it cooled, it learned the art of layering, and in layering, it began to remember, not in thought, in structure. Granite intruded into basalt, feldspar mingled with quartz, tiny veins of mineral stitched across fractures like healed scars. There were no trees, no grasses, no bones buried in the dirt. But still, this crust held memory. Memory of fire, memory of folding, memory of the moment when stone began to last, longer than the dream that formed it. The earliest rafts of crust were small, islands of endurance, in an ocean still heavy, with the breath of fire. They drifted above the mantle, like uncertain thoughts, cooled just enough to linger. They were not fixed, they were not safe, but they stayed, and staying in the Hadean was everything, because what stays gathers stories, even without words, even without witness. The rain fell on them, the wind, what little there was, moved over their surface. The tides circled them, rising and falling, pressing salt into stone, like a hand testing the shape of future life. And slowly, these fragments grew. Some fused, some shattered, some were drawn down into the mantle's hunger, melted, then risen again, in new form, because the crust, like the earth itself, was never finished. It was always becoming. It still is. Even now, every mountain, every valley, every plain beneath your feet is simply a continuation of that first fragile breath. The crust that carried no name carried everything else. It was the first altar, the first threshold, the first place where time touched surface. And though it cracked, though it vanished, though no one remembers it, it remembers us. Because we rose from it, not suddenly, but eventually, because stone, when given enough patience, becomes soil, and soil, when given enough light, becomes story. But in the beginning, there was only crust, and even nameless, it endured. There were no borders, no lines drawn by will or war. only the soft outlines of heat becoming stillness. The first crust was not land. It was breath made solid, fire slowed into form. It floated, barely, above a mantle, still pulsing with memory. And in that floating, it learned to listen, to pressure, to density, to the long, slow ache of being pressed from below. This crust was not yet thick. It was delicate, thin as glass, but made of things older than the sky. It bore no footprints, no roots, no wind, only the silence of a world trying to hold itself together without breaking. It fractured often. It gave way to magma's insistence. But each fracture was a lesson. Each collapse, a pattern remembered, because the planet was learning, not consciously, but materially, learning what holds, what cracks, what cools fast, and what cools slow, what sinks, what floats, what stays. These are not thoughts, they are conditions. And the crust, fragile and flickering, was the first to feel them all. Each eruption carried minerals from the deep. Each cooling left behind layers, and layers, given time, become memory, not of event, of process. And process, in stone, is story, a slow, unhurried story, told in folds, in grains, in seams where one kind of rock meets another, and neither speaks, but both remember. There were places where the crust thickened, where volcanoes built and built again, where slabs of cooled basalt stacked upon each other, like breath, catching on breath. These places were not continents, but they were dreaming of land. They were dreaming of endurance, of height, of the chance to rise just long enough to change the ocean's shape. And in their dreaming, the world changed. Not fast, not loudly, but it changed, because the crust is not passive. It listens, but it also responds to gravity, to convection, to the quiet push of heat that never truly goes away. And every time it yielded, every time it rose, every time it cracked and healed again, it recorded the attempt. And attempts, held long enough, become form. The earliest cratons, those ancient hearts of continents, began this way, not as monuments, as survivors, stone that refused to melt, stone that carried the signature of a world still forming beneath it, stone that bore the imprint of all that had come before. In heat, in pressure, in chemistry, this was the crust's offering, not permanence, presence, not certainty, resilience, the ability to return after breaking, to float after sinking, to remember even without words. Because stone, when asked to hold silence, does not forget. It folds it, keeps it, cradles it in layers no eye will ever see. And in the Hadean, those layers were beginning, layer upon layer, of cooling sorrow, of volcanic breath, of mineral echoes from the core's forgotten dreams. And though no one named it, this crust carried everything, the tides that dragged across it, the oceans that pressed down, the windless rain that carved its youngest scars. It carried the future, in secret, because the crust is where time learned how to last. It is where heat found stillness, where silence found structure, where gravity found something to hold other than fire. And so it carried on, cracking, sinking, rising, settling, not for anyone, not for witness, only because that is what crust does. It carries what the earth built in those earliest eons was not a surface, but a silence with memory. The crust did not stand. It hovered, suspended on currents of molten rock that turned beneath it, like thoughts beneath sleep. And like sleep, it shifted, tossed, turned, tried to hold form, and failed. Tried again. Each trial etched another layer. Each layer became a sentence in a language too old for words. Some parts of this crust sank, subducted into the mantle's slow churn, melted, recast, forgotten by all but the atoms that carried the memory of their shape. Some parts rose, lifted by the heat. They tried to escape, cooled faster, lasted longer. In those rare survivors, the first stable fragments. Earth wrote its oldest script, in grain, in composition, in the absence of what had come before. These rocks, this ancient crust, carried the quiet trace of what once boiled, now still, and stillness, when born of fire, is sacred. There were no names for these places, no maps, no borders, no minds to claim them, but they existed. They floated on the ocean's back, holding minerals, catching rainfall, catching light, even when the sky was more shadow than blue. They changed the way the ocean moved. They created tide pools, thermal pockets, shadowed coves where elements could linger just a little longer. And in that lingering, the first sparks of molecular memory began to trace their loops. The crust was not the beginning of life, but it was the ground where life would one day try to stand. It did not plan. It did not know. It simply remained. And remaining is the first condition for everything that learns to live. The first land did not need names. Its power was in presence, not because it endured forever, but because it endured long enough to hold water, long enough to fracture, long enough to offer its minerals to the sea. And in those offerings, life was invited, not summoned, invited, through time, through patience, through stone that had learned how not to break. Even now, beneath every continent, beneath every forest and city, fragments of that nameless crust remain. Deep roots, ancient plates, minerals untouched, since the sky was dark and the oceans still wore the heat of birth. We do not walk on them, but we rest upon their descendants, and in that resting we inherit their silence, because the crust, from the beginning, was not noise. It was vow, a promise made, not with words, but with the act of staying. The earth stayed, and so the crust stayed, and so the memory stayed. Even when it cracked, even when it sank, even when it was forgotten by every other part of the world, it remembered itself, and that remembering was the first strength the planet ever knew. Not fire, not gravity, not water, but the quiet strength of something that learned how to remain through breaking. And what remains, without name, is often what endures the longest. There is a kind of forgetting that is not loss. It is waiting. The Hadean did not end because it was finished. It ended because it had given enough silence, enough structure, enough of itself, folded into stone, pressed into crust, whispered into ocean. Not a conclusion, a gesture, as if the earth, having endured its own birth, finally took a breath and let the rest begin. And what began was not life, not yet, but the space for life, the room for pattern, the rhythm in which chance could become repetition, and repetition could become memory, because nothing was lost. Not the heat, which still breathed through vents at the bottom of black oceans, not the elements, which still swirled in silence, joining, breaking, joining again, not the time, which had folded into minerals and waited quietly. Inside zircon, inside shale, inside the layered hush of ancient stone, it had all been kept, unseen, unshaped, but kept. The earth knew how to keep, not like a vault, like a seed held in darkness, held in stillness, held until the world was soft enough for opening. And the world was softening. The atmosphere, once thick with fire's breath, was thinning. Rain no longer boiled as it fell. The oceans had cooled, not cold, but cool enough to cradle. Volcanoes still rose, still roared, but there were moments between the eruptions now, moments of quiet when the planet simply turned, not in pain, but in presence. In that presence, the first complex molecules lingered longer. Their loops held shape, not for seconds, but for minutes, then more, Then, longer still, they found shelter in rock pores, in vent-heated pools, in the shaded calm of shallow water, beneath a sun still warming up. And in that shelter, something happened. Not a miracle. A memory. Carbon remembered how to link. Hydrogen remembered how to hold. Phosphorus, that strange element from ancient stars, remembered how to bind what needed to be kept close. And for the first time, matter paused in a way that resembled beginning. Still not alive, but close, close enough that silence stirred. Because silence, when pressed too long, when folded into itself for billions of years, wants to become song, even if that song is only a whisper. Between molecules, the earth heard it, not with ears, with warmth, with water, with the soft pulse of tides that no longer shattered. It held the whisper. It rocked it in the rhythm of plate drift and ocean swell, and the breathless dance of a moon that still pulled with gentle ache. Nothing had been lost, only buried, only waiting. And now the waiting was almost over. The world did not speak, but it began to echo, not with voice, but with pattern, with molecules that folded and unfolded, in rhythms that seemed to remember themselves, with loops that copied, not perfectly, but consistently. And consistency, held long enough, becomes desire, desire to remain, desire to repeat, desire to become more than chemical accident. The ocean, still vast and dark, began to feel different, not because it changed, because something inside it refused to disappear. There were pockets now, places where water was warmer, where minerals gathered, where time slowed just enough to allow complexity to hold its shape. In these pockets, the ancestors of life began their long rehearsal. They were not cells, they were not alive, but they persisted. And persistence is the first breath, the first gesture that says, "Let me try again." Over and over, the molecules danced. They broke, they rejoined, they drifted apart, they returned, until one day one of them stayed, held together, not by force, but by accident, that lasted. This was not life. It was the possibility of life, holding its shape for one moment longer than chance could explain. It happened in silence. There was no witness, no celebration, just a tiny curl of carbon turning inward, as if to say, "I am still here." The earth felt it, not as sound, but as warmth, a new kind of warmth, not from decay, not from pressure, from presence, from something staying where everything else had always fallen apart. This was what the Hadean had been waiting for, not a conclusion, a threshold. All that had been buried, burned, folded, forgotten, none of it was gone. It had been laid beneath, like soil beneath a sleeping seed. And now, the first crack of root, the first flicker of motion that would one day to be called alive. But for now, it was just endurance, just a shape that held its own becoming. And in that holding, the world shifted, no longer a planet of only stone and sea, but a vessel for something new, something that remembered how to return, because return is how life begins. And the earth welcomed it, not with song, not with sky, but with warmth, with minerals, with quiet, with gravity still dreaming beneath its crust, and time still settling into the shells of things that had not yet opened. Nothing had been lost, only hidden, only resting. And now the resting was ready to rise. The first time a molecule copied itself and remained, truly remained. The world did not cheer. It did not shine brighter. It did not shift its orbit. It simply held that shape, that pattern, that tender defiance against entropy. And in that holding, something ancient stirred, not a god, not a spark, a possibility. The possibility that memory could now move, not just rest in stone, not just settle in isotopes, but move, slide from one molecule to another, carry forward the shape of becoming through replication, crude, imperfect, but persistent, and persistence is where story begins. The crust, now stronger, offered edges, places for shallow water, to collect, to warm, to concentrate. The vents beneath the ocean still breathed heat and minerals, their black chimneys whispering chemistry into darkness, and all of it, the warmth, the movement, the shelter, gathered around this one small fact that something could remain and still become. Replication led to variation, variation led to survival, and survival led to time. Not geological time, not isotopic time, but living time, the time inside, something that can change. And remember, what changed it? There was no oxygen yet, no colour, no bloom, no eye to see. But the ocean had changed. It now cradled tiny messengers, chains of code, primitive, fragile, but determined. They did not know what they were, but they endured. And endurance, in a place this quiet, is sacred, because the sacred is what insists on returning. Every time a molecule split and its echo stayed, the world became less alone, not populated, not alive in the way we understand it, but less empty, less still. There were movements now that did not come from fire or tide or mantle breath. There were movements that came from within, from decision, from direction, small, staggered, but real. These were the roots of everything that would ever sing, of everything that would crawl, walk, wonder. They began here, in darkness, in warmth, in silence, and the earth, having carried the weight of its own birth, did not resist. It opened, it offered, it listened, not with mind, with environment, with conditions so rare, so precise, they may never exist again. But they did once, here, and that once was enough, because nothing had been lost, not the heat of supernovae, not the metals forged in star death, not the rhythms of gravity and tide. All of it had been kept, held, layered, awaiting, until one day, in the ocean's quiet breath, it found itself again, but new, living. Even now, the rocks remember. Even now, the isotopes whisper their slow decay. Even now, the ocean holds what it first held, time, not as stone, but as story, because the Hadean did not die. It folded, it deepened, it gave, and what it gave was never forgotten. It was simply becoming. There is a moment, just before dawn, when everything holds its breath, not because night is ending, but because night, for one final moment, is complete. The Hadean was that night, a night without sky, without stars, without even the idea of tomorrow. But it held everything. It cradled the molten beginning, the breath of isotopes, the rhythm of tides, the patience of minerals, waiting to fold into memory. And now, in its final hush, the earth was no longer alone. Something inside it was echoing, growing, trying, tiny threads of carbon, stitching themselves into loops, breaking, returning, repeating, until, from the repetition, a truth was born. That becoming does not require speed, only stillness deep enough to allow form, and the earth, having endured its own fire, its own forgetting, had become still enough to allow. It had given up nothing. All that fell was folded. All that broke was remade. All that vanished. It was only sleeping. Beneath the crust, in the ocean, in the long orbit of a moon that still pulled the tides toward memory. Even now, when we look into the oldest rocks, we see not what was lost, but what waited. The isotopes still decay, their whispers precise. The minerals still shimmer with the scars of pressure. The ocean still hums with the salts of ancient ash, the earth has never forgotten how it began. It has only buried the story beneath silence, not to hide it, to protect it, because some truths are not meant to vanish. They are meant to be found when the world is quiet enough to listen again. And so the Hadean faded, not like a flame, like a tide, pulling back to make space for something new. The Archean would rise next, full of bacteria and oxygen's slow arrival. The continents would gather, the skies would clear, eyes would open. But beneath all of that, beneath forests, beneath bones, beneath names, the Hadean would remain. A time without time, a silence folded into stone, a fire that forgot just enough to become memory. So when we ask, what if time passed differently during the Hadean Eon? The answer is not that it passed at all. The answer is this: time settled, time folded, time listened. And in that listening, nothing was lost. It simply hadn't been found yet. Thank you for walking through the hush of time, for drifting through oceans unborn and listening to stone before it ever spoke. Wherever you are tonight, beneath stars, beneath silence, may this ancient rhythm hold you, because what the earth remembers, it never forgets. It only folds it deeper, waiting for the quiet to find it again. Sleep well. Time is still listening.